All right, we are recording now. Oh, okay. There are some topics like women having power on their head because of the angels, 1 Corinthians 11, or the problem of virgins in 1 Corinthians 7, that are so far removed from us culturally that we'll probably never understand exactly what Paul means in those passages. He assumes that they know what he means, and they did, but we don't. And so, again, it's a letter. It's not a systematic treatise where he goes into all the background to explain everything that is going on. Now, by the end of the first century, Paul's letters had been put into what we call a corpus, a collection. It may have been a gradual process, or it may be that someone just took upon themselves, in a very short period of time, to collect all of Paul's letters. David Trobisch, in his book, Paul's Letter Collection, proposes that Paul himself was the one who collected his letters. Whenever we have letters by Paul in the Greek manuscripts, they're always in collections. We don't have any loose letters floating around by themselves. They all have the same titles when they have titles on them. And it's pretty good evidence that from a very early date that they were collected into this corpus. The order of the letters is almost without exception uniform in all the New Testament manuscripts that we have. It's unlikely that that would happen if there were different collections floating around. The evidence seems to show that there was an original collection of Paul's 13 letters, and then Hebrews was added at a later time. Sometimes it was put after Romans. Sometimes it was put at the end of the Pauline collection, as it is in our Bibles. Here is the order of Paul's epistles. I'm sorry, I put up the wrong PowerPoint. Excuse me here. All right. Here's the order of Paul's epistles. You'll notice that it is in the order of the churches by length, and then individuals by length. So we start with Romans. Romans down through 2 Thessalonians is churches. The longest is at the beginning, Romans. The shortest is at the end with 2 Thessalonians. So they go longest to shortest. The only exception here is that Ephesians is slightly longer than Galatians. And I don't have an explanation for that. Maybe they miscounted when they put them together or something. But then if you go down to 1 Timothy, down through Philemon, again, it's those that are written to individuals, longest to shortest. So 1 Timothy is the longest, Philemon is the shortest. And then that is followed by the book of Hebrews. Another bit of evidence that Paul's epistles go back to a single collection is that the titles of these are all the same, uniformly the same. even Ephesians, in the manuscripts that don't have in Ephesus in the first part of the first chapter there, the address is still called to the Ephesians. Again, it would be very unlikely if they were various collections of different kinds. Recently, Paul's epistles have been grouped into various ways for the purpose of study. First and Second Thessalonians, eschatological, the coming of Christ. Galatians, First and Second Corinthians, and Romans, they're soteriological, the cross of Christ. Colossians to Philippians, Christological, the character of Christ. 1 Timothy, Titus, 2 Timothy, eschatological, ecclesiological, the church of Christ. In terms of the authenticity of Paul's letters, and here we deal with, did Paul really write these letters? Or were they written by someone else who put Paul's name on them? We'll deal with this more in New Testament introduction, but here we have a chart with 3 columns. The left column is labeled liberal, the middle column moderate, and the right column conservative. Liberals accept 7 letters as being truly written by Paul, and that's Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Virtually everybody accepts these as being genuinely written by Paul. Now, in the moderate category, you have those 7 plus Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. So a moderate scholar would accept those 10, and then conservative scholars would accept all 13. So it would be those 10 plus 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. The 7 in the left column, like I said, are accepted by everyone. And sometimes conservative scholars who believe that Paul wrote all of the epistles attributed to him only deal with the 7 in the left column. And they do that so that everybody will accept their writing. So that you won't have liberals saying, well, you know, Paul didn't really write this, so I'm not going to pay any attention to this. Or this scholar is not as good as us liberal scholars, that kind of thing. I know N.T. Wright, when he first began writing, did that. Now he accepts more of them. In fact, I believe he writes on all 13. But when you only accept 7 letters like that as being authentic, it's like having a canon within the canon. You only pay attention to certain books, which means if you're going to write a Pauline theology, it's incomplete because you're not taking into account the other 6 letters that were written by Paul. I don't know of any major scholar today who believes that Paul wrote Hebrews. Virtually everybody, liberal, moderate, and conservative, say that Paul did not write Hebrews. Let me, I'll just give you a quote from Hans Conzelmann, a liberal scholar. He says, only the letters of Paul can be used as sources, that's for Paul's life, not Acts. Its picture of Paul's theology is not authentic. For reasons of method, only the undisputed authentic letters are to be used. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Colossians and 2nd Thessalonians are also usually accepted as authentic. Ephesians is more strongly disputed. The pastoral epistles are usually taken to be inauthentic. All these letters show ideas from the genuine Pauline epistles in a particular transformation and therefore occupy a special position. For reasons of exactness, they must therefore be excluded to begin with. Now, the reason that we bring this up here is that you will read books on the New Testament that say that especially the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, were not written by Paul. And if you are writing your paper on one of the pastoral epistles, then you're going to run across that. Just be prepared for it. I believe that Paul wrote all 13, and there's good reason for that. And but just be prepared for the fact that not all scholars believe that Paul wrote all 13 of those. So in this course, we are going to consider all of Paul's letters as being authentically by Paul. There's really no compelling reason to omit them. Okay, do you have any questions here before we go on? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was just wondering, like, aren't these letters written at different times? So how could they all be like grouped together, like in one whole, as you said, in a corpus, you said?
They probably were grouped into this corpus at around the end of the 1st century. So there was a short period of time in which they were not grouped, but early on they were grouped. So probably around the year 100, by that time we have what we call the Pauline corpus. Okay. Okay. Any other questions?
And then there is the on the PowerPoint where you showed how the epistles are like ordered in from the longest to the smallest. Then like even within that there are like differences. It's not all in descending order, isn't it?
It's not all what?
In descending order.
There's one exception. Galatians and Ephesians actually should be flipped.
Yeah, like, but like Thessalonians is in the middle, but it's still like not the shortest. Like if it should have been at the very end if it's the shortest among all 13.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is the way it works. It's to churches first.
Okay.
Okay, to churches from longest to the shortest.
Okay.
And then to individuals from longest to shortest.
All right. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I don't know if
Yes.
it's according with this, but for example, in the beginning, you say that some situations about the woman and things very specifically that Paul was writing to the church. How we in this time, how we can interpret that this is this is for us, or this is only for that time? This is an order for us, or only to that time?
That's a very good question, Genesis, and hopefully this class will help us understand that. How do we determine if something is for all time, for all situations, or for a particular time and a particular situation? For example, you don't wear head coverings when you go to church, and yet Paul says that a woman should be covered. Evidently, that is not for all times and all places. This is a real point of controversy. When you look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul's teaching on women, instructing men, usurping authority over men. Is that something that Paul is giving a directive for the church for all time? Or is it a particular situation in Ephesus at that particular time? And so we have to deal with these kind of questions. And I personally believe that it was for that particular time, and there was a certain situation that Paul is responding to.
And second,
Okay.
so like, how can they collect this letters? Is it that possible? Like, Paul wrote the letter to the recipient, and
Thank
he also keep one copy, like a draft for himself.
Yes, at the beginning, someone would have gotten that letter, which was on a papyrus scroll, and they would have copied it word for word onto another scroll. There were no photocopy machines, no movable type printing presses, so it was all done by hand. And then later on, someone else would have copied that. And when we do New Testament introduction, we will go into this process of how this was done, which is a fascinating thing to study. But yes, it would have been by someone who was interested. They would have gotten it. They would have made a copy. Somebody else would have made a copy. And before too many decades go by, we have multiple copies. Okay. Any other questions? All right, let us go on then. Okay, here we're going to deal with the new perspective on Paul. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, the way I would in Pauline theology or New Testament theology or even New Testament introduction. But I want to introduce this to you because this has been the most controversial, well, I guess controversial would be the description to use over the last 4 decades. When I was in seminary, I took a course on, it's called Paulinism, Paul's life and theology. And Pauline studies has completely changed since those days. And it's because of the new perspective. I'm not going to cover in class everything that is in the PowerPoint. I would like for you to look that over on your own, simply because we don't have time to go into all of the details. But I would like just to give you a succinct introduction to the new perspective. I'm not going to read all of this, but I do think it's important. But the new perspective on Paul comes from a new perspective on first century Judaism. Was first century Judaism a religion of legalism, of people wanting to earn their way to heaven, of people keeping all the rules? And that is the way we normally think of Judaism during the time of Christ and Paul. Now, there were those in decades past who wrote that that is not the way Judaism was in the first century, that it was rather a religion of forgiveness, a religion of grace. One of those is a man by the name of Claude Montefiore. Another, George Foot Moore, back in the early 1900s. And then in the mid 20th century, W.D. Davies. All of these people said that the religion of the first century, Judaism of the first century, was a religion of grace, a religion of forgiveness. They could get forgiveness by offering sacrifice in the temple. And it wasn't the legalistic religion that we normally think that it was. Christer Stendhal wrote an article in 1963, the Harvard Theological Review, entitled "The Apostle Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West." And he said, why do we believe that first century Judaism was legalistic and that people were trying to earn their way to heaven? He says it all goes back to Martin Luther, because Martin Luther came out of the legalistic Roman Catholic Church in the 1500s. And because the Roman Catholic Church was legalistic, he interpreted first century Judaism as being legalistic. Luther discovered justification by faith, in which he was freed from the burden of guilt that he had felt for so long, and saw Paul teaching that same doctrine in the first century. So Stendhal says it doesn't come from the New Testament, it comes from Martin Luther, this idea that Judaism was legalistic. He also says that Paul didn't have any guilty conscience in those days, that he was very satisfied with his life under the law, which I think he's probably right on that. The one who really started what we call the new perspective on Paul is a man by the name of E.P. Sanders. In 1977, he wrote a book entitled Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And there he said what others before him had said, that the Judaism of the first century was not legalistic. But you know, in Paul and in the Gospels also, the Jews come across as legalistic. You know, when you see the way they are depicted, the Pharisees, for example, are depicted in the Gospels. You know, they strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. They tithe on all the minute things. They wash their hands. They do all of these things. It seems to be very legalistic. Also, they had their values in the wrong place, because they would take advantage of widows. They would not do a lot of things good, but they made sure that they kept all of the rules. So their lives were ruled by rules. Rather than having their heart be right, they made sure that they didn't break any of the rules. And also in the Pauline epistles, it seems like that there are people who are earning their way to heaven by keeping the works of the law. Now, I'm not going to go into detail here on Sanders, but his goal in writing the book was to destroy the view of Judaism that had been held by so many people. Ferdinand Weber was one who really held to that and was very influential on the generations following him. And I'm not going to go into all that Weber said, but he was followed by Rudolf Bultmann, a very influential New Testament scholar of the 20th century. Okay. Let me just go on here. Let me give you a quote here. Covenantal nomism is the view that one's place in God's plan is established on the basis of the covenant, and that the covenant requires as the proper response of man his obedience to its commandments, while providing means of atonement for transgression. Obedience maintains one's position in the covenant, but does not earn God's grace as such. This idea of covenantal nomism is very important for Sanders and for all of those who follow him. It means that a Jew does not enter into the covenant relationship by keeping the law. Rather, by birth, he is elected. He is part of God's family. And he maintains his status in the family by keeping the commandments. So he doesn't get into the covenant by keeping the commandments, but he maintains his status there as a covenant member by keeping the commandments. So Sanders says, therefore, it's not legalism, because legalism is earning your way into heaven. You know, my response to that would be, if it's keeping the commandments just to stay in the covenant, it's still legalism. It's still keeping the rules. You're going to be loved by God if you keep the rules. And if you don't keep the rules, you're not going to stay part of the people of God. So whichever way it goes, it is still legalism. That's my opinion. According to Sanders, Paul rejects Judaism only because it is not Christianity. So Paul, on the road to Damascus, has an encounter with Jesus Christ, and his whole perspective changes. He sees that Jesus is the Messiah. But before that, he was very happy in Judaism. He thought he was pleasing God by persecuting Christians. The reason he rejects Judaism, according to Sanders, is not that there was something wrong with Judaism, but that he discovered Christ. And the only reason he rejects Judaism is that it's not Christianity. Okay, Sanders has been followed by many, many people in this new perspective on Paul. In fact, it could be a majority of scholars that have followed Sanders in this. I just want to mention two evangelical scholars who have adopted the new perspective on Paul. One is a man by the name of James D.G. Dunn, who just within the last week or two died. He's an evangelical scholar, although I would say he's on the edge of evangelicalism. He has some ideas that I don't think many evangelicals would hold to. But he has been very influential in promoting the new perspective on Paul. And I'm not going to go into everything that he says here. We'll critique a little bit on down the line here. As you can tell, I'm going really fast. you can go back over the PowerPoint and you can see all of this for yourself. Now, the other evangelical scholar, who truly is an evangelical scholar, is N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright is the most influential New Testament scholar of our day. If you're going to study New Testament studies, you're going to have to deal with N.T. Wright. And I don't know how many books he's written, probably 100. I think he writes one every Tuesday. But he's very influential, and so we need to take him seriously. There are the only thing I want to mention about Wright and the new perspective here is his idea of justification. Justification by faith, of course, is the heart of the Reformation. Martin Luther discovered justification by faith, and that transformed his life and began the Protestant Reformation. So that is at the heart of the Protestant faith, probably at the heart of your faith as well. For Wright sees justification completely differently. For Luther, justification is God's declaration that you are right with him. It is legal language. It is language that a judge would give in a courtroom. He would take his gavel and he would hammer it here on the bench, and he would say either guilty or not guilty. If he says guilty, then you are condemned. If he says not guilty, you are justified. And so for Luther, this was the process of becoming a Christian. When you come to faith in God through Jesus Christ, and go to Ephesians 2:8-9, for it is by grace that you are saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. And so what happens in justification is God's declaring us righteous, is God's forgiving us of our sins, and it's at the heart of being saved. We call it soteriological. For Wright, it's completely different. For Wright, justification is not soteriological. It really has nothing to do with one becoming a Christian. For Wright, justification is God's pronouncement of who is and who is not part of God's people. So it is not becoming a Christian. It is what God does after we become a Christian in declaring who belongs to the people of God. So for both Luther and Wright, it is a declaration of God. For Luther, it is a declaration of God on his judgment seat that you are forgiven, you are my child, the price has been paid for your salvation, you're free. For Wright, justification is something that happens later. And it is God's declaring, this person is my child. This person belongs to the people of God. Okay, hey, it's time for a break. We'll stop here and then we will take up in 10 minutes. Have a good one.